He simply walked along the mountain trail when he accidentally noticed a narrow crevice in the rock. It wasn't a cave, too narrow, too hidden, but inside awaited something that physically couldn't be there. A container, intact and sealed. When he opened it, the blood drained from his face because what he saw wasn't treasure, it was a warning. Subscribe and write in the comments from which city or country you're watching this video. The sky over the mountains was low and dim, the air thick as if holding its breath before a weather change. Ethan Malley walked slowly, not because he was tired, but because he was accustomed to moving that way, without fuss, without unnecessary gestures. His gait was even, economical, like that of a man who had long been used to counting every step. Tall, slightly above average height, broad-shouldered with a solid build hardened not by the gym but by years of physical labor, he looked older than his years. The stubble on his face was uneven, dark, as if he had stopped tending to it not out of laziness but indifference. His grey eyes, deeply set, rarely lingered on any one thing. They constantly scanned the space, assessing, comparing, memorizing. Moscow was left behind not only in kilometers but in sensations. The city had taught Ethan one main rule. Space is never neutral. Every street belongs to someone, every glance is a question, every gesture a potential explanation. After serving in the North Caucasus, he returned a different man, not broken, that would have been simpler, but shifted. His internal rhythm no longer matched the city's. Noise affected him not as sound but as pressure. Even the silence in Moscow was filled with anticipation. Cameras, rules, schedules, faces, everything demanded a reaction, everything implied participation. He learned to be inconspicuous not because he was afraid, but because he was tired of explaining who he had become after the war. Veteran, a word that simplifies too much and hides too much. The mountains were different, they didn't ask questions. They were indifferent to who came and why. Stone doesn't distinguish the past, the forest doesn't care where you're from. Here, there was no need to conform, only to walk. Ethan chose a route away from popular paths, closer to the eastern slopes where trails were less frequently maintained and tourists appeared only in the short season. He was drawn not to the views but to the voids between them, long stretches where nothing happened. There, thought said goodbye, and the body returned to basic tasks. Breathing, step, balance. He carried a light backpack without extra gear. His phone was turned off. He didn't listen to music on principle. He didn't want to drown out the sounds of the environment. Over years of solo outings, he had learned to read the weather by the color and smell of the air, to distinguish danger from discomfort. This journey was planned meticulously. Late season, minimal people, routes without shelters, solitude without isolation, challenge without foolishness. The first hours passed calmly. The trail ascended through sparse forest, then emerged onto an open slope where soil gave way to stone and grass clung only to cracks. The sky remained light but somehow faded, not threatening, but alerting. The air was thick, as if saturated with the expectation of rain or snow. By midday, Ethan reached the point where the official trail veered sharply right, skirting a massive rock wall. He stopped, removed his gloves, pulled out the map. By all calculations, the detour was safe but long. His gaze kept returning to the slope above, where there were no markings but a faint trace left by erosion and perhaps rare footsteps. He didn't decide immediately. He sat on a rock, took a few sips of water, watching the clouds slowly thicken over the ridge. The weather was changing, but not abruptly. It was that state he called heavy air, when nothing has happened yet, but the body already feels the shift. The decision wasn't impulsive. He weighed time, strength, risk. Shortening the route justified the climb. He knew such terrain, he had done it before. And yet, when he left the marked trail, the change was felt immediately. The ground underfoot became less predictable, rhythm vanished. Every step required attention. He shortened his stride, testing support before shifting weight. The rock above him was uneven, ancient, without signs of recent collapse. It didn't seem hostile, rather indifferent. The sounds of the valley gradually faded. The wind here moved differently, sliding along the stone rather than passing through. Ethan noted another detail. The absence of birds, no cries, no movement in the sky. It didn't cause alarm but lingered in his mind. The space seemed not empty but detached. And then he saw the line. At first, it appeared to him as an ordinary crack, a play of light, shadow, perspective. But the higher he climbed, the more obvious it became. The line was too straight. It ran at an angle, uninterrupted, not submitting to the chaos of the rock surface. He stopped, changed his viewing angle. The line remained. Approaching closer, he noticed a difference in the stone's texture around it. The weathering didn't match the surface here, looked younger, as if disturbed. He ran his gloved hand over it and felt a barely noticeable temperature difference, so faint it could be dismissed as imagination. Stepping aside, he saw how the line broke, revealing a narrow darkness where there should have been solid rock. The crevice was vertical, irregular, but surprisingly narrow. From a few meters away, it vanished completely. Ethan crouched, carefully studying the find. Cool air barely perceptibly escaped from inside. There was no smell of moisture, no animal tracks. It wasn't a lair, not a natural shelter. He straightened and looked back from below. The crevice was invisible. The geometry hid it completely. That alerted him more than the find itself. He stood there longer than planned. Military habit didn't allow him to act without assessment. Curiosity battled discipline. He knew he could just turn around and continue, but the feeling was different. Neither excitement nor fear, rather, a sense that the step had already been taken, and this was merely continuation. Ethan removed his backpack, secured it firmly, and cautiously tested the stone with his boot. The support held. He turned sideways and approached the narrow darkness, not knowing that this moment would become the boundary between the familiar dimension of his life and that which defied the map. The mountains were silent. Ethan stood motionless, listening not so much to the mountains as to himself. The wind at his back died down, as if the slope itself decided to hold its breath. He slowly removed his backpack and placed it at the base of the rock, carefully checking that it couldn't slide down. The habit forged by years of service didn't allow him to leave gear unsecured, even here, even now. He crouched, assessing the crevice's width. The opening was narrow, uneven, but clearly not accidental. Shoulders would pass if turned sideways, the backpack wouldn't. That immediately ruled out the thought of casual use by tourists or animals. Ethan inhaled deeply and stepped forward. The stone closed around him almost immediately. Cold penetrated through his jacket, but it was dry, clean, as if the air here was stored separately from the outside world. That sensation alerted him the most. Over years of hikes, he had been in dozens of caves and fissures. Everywhere there was the smell of dampness, minerals, decay. Here, there was nothing. He moved slowly, sideways, checking every point of support. The stone was rough but stable. No crumbling, no movement. The walls didn't breathe, didn't echo, they simply existed. His breathing sounded muffled, as if the space around absorbed the sound before it could form. The crevice didn't widen, it gradually seemed to tolerate his presence, allowing passage only to a certain point. Then the pressure eased sharply. The stone on the left retreated first, opening into emptiness. Ethan stopped, pressed his palms against the wall, and cautiously shifted his weight forward. He emerged into a space where he could stand upright. The air here was noticeably colder but still dry. The floor underfoot was unexpectedly even, not just relatively even, but geometrically leveled, without the chaotic variations typical of natural cavities. His boots made a dull sound, not stony, not hollow, but muffled, as if the surface was designed to absorb vibration. Ethan slowly turned, surveying. The light from the crevice behind turned into a thin, curved line, barely illuminating the edge of the space. He mentally noted its position, angle, height. In the army, he was taught, if you enter where you can't see the exit, you must remember its shape. He turned on his headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness and hit the opposite wall. The stone here was different. The surface lacked chaotic structure. Long, shallow parallel traces stretched along it, as if someone or something had passed along the wall with uniform force. It didn't resemble waterwork or tectonic shift. He approached closer and ran his hand over the stone under his fingers. There was smoothness interrupted only by fine lines. These traces weren't decorative, they were functional, as if the wall wasn't adorned but fitted to a task. The silence here was not the absence of sound but its suppression. Even the light rustle of his jacket seemed superfluous. Ethan caught himself moving slower than necessary, as if afraid to disrupt the space's balance. It was irrational, but instinct insisted. He crouched and touched the floor. The dust layer was thin, even, without signs of recent presence. No footprints, no scratches. This place hadn't hosted guests for a long time, or hosted them so rarely that traces had time to vanish completely. Ethan straightened and took a few steps forward. The space expanded, extending deeper. The ceiling was lost in darkness, The headlamp beam didn't reach it. The walls smoothly converged upward, forming a shape more architectural than natural. There was no sense of randomness here. The thought came suddenly but clearly. This isn't a cave, this is a volume created by removal, not destruction. The stone hadn't collapsed, it had been removed precisely, methodically, without signs of haste. The absence of debris confirmed that everything excess had been carried away. Where, he didn't know. His breathing evened out, but inside, tension grew, not fear, but awareness of scale. Someone had invested effort, time, and knowledge to create this space in the mountain's body, far from everything, not for beauty, not for shelter from rain. Ethan stopped, allowing his eyes to adjust, and then he saw the reflection. A faint, sharp glint appeared in the depths when the headlamp beam changed angle. It was too straight, too clean to be mineral. Metal, cold, alien. It reflected light differently than stone. Ethan froze, his heart quickened, but movements remained controlled. He didn't step forward until he confirmed the space was stable. Then, slowly, he moved toward the glint source. With each step, the sense of artificiality intensified. Walls became smoother, the floor even more polished. The space seemed to adapt to something at its center. It wasn't coincidence, it was design. He stopped at the edge of light and darkness. The headlamp beam slid over a vertical plane and bounced back. The plane was even, too even. Metal. Ethan didn't approach closer, he stood, allowing the fact to settle. Everything he had seen up to this point led to one conclusion that his mind refused to fully accept. Inside the mountain was something that had no right to be here. He glanced back. The entry crevice now seemed even narrower, almost unreal, as if the mountain had allowed him passage only conditionally, as if it wasn't an invitation but a test. Ethan returned his gaze to the metallic reflection. It hadn't vanished. It waited. And at that moment, he understood. Everything before this, the route, the decision to shortcut, the choice of solitude, no longer mattered. He crossed the boundary, not physical, but conceptual. What lay ahead wasn't part of the mountain, but the mountain had become part of it. The headlamp beam trembled when Ethan took another step forward. The light, sliding over the stone, suddenly hit a straight vertical and bounced back with a sharp glint. He stopped immediately, as if he had encountered not an object but a limit of the permissible. Before him stood a container, a full-size shipping container of standard proportions, the kind he had seen hundreds of times on rail platforms and industrial zones. Only here, in the heart of the mountain, it looked not just alien, it looked impossible. The metal was covered in uneven, dry rust spots, as if corrosion had proceeded slowly over years in an environment without moisture. The paint had long faded, but the corners, stiffeners, and fasteners remained intact. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling his internal balance shift. His body didn't react with panic. Instead, it switched to that state familiar from service, cold, almost detached focus. When what's happening doesn't fit the worldview, you don't reject it, you start checking details. He approached closer, not rushing, carefully watching the floor. The stone surface underfoot remained even, without cracks or debris. The container stood straight, without tilt, as if installed level. That immediately caught the eye of a man accustomed to noticing such details. In the army, he learned to detect when something stood wrong, even if it looked normal externally. The container's size left no doubt. It was too large, too long, too whole. Even imagining it disassembled, carried in, reassembled, traces of that process should remain. Blasts, cuts, welds. There were none. Ethan circled the container in an arc, keeping distance. The headlamp beam slid over the metal surface, highlighting details. Standard corner fittings, reinforced doors, massive locking bars, all looked industrially mundane, almost boring. And that made it even more unsettling. There was no symbolism, no display of power or secret sign. This was a utilitarian object created for function. He crouched and touched the floor at the container's base. The stone here was slightly darker, not from moisture, from pressure. Over years, possibly decades, the metal's weight slowly compacted the surface, leaving a mark impossible to fake in short time. The container had stood here for a long time. The dust around its base lay even, without signs of displacement, no drips, no piles. It hadn't been disturbed by recent movement. If the container had been moved, it was very long ago, or not moved at all. That thought gradually formed in his mind, not as sudden revelation, but as a chain of inevitable conclusions. The container wasn't carried into the cave was created around the container. Ethan straightened, feeling a chill run down his back, unrelated to temperature. That meant a completely different level of effort, planning, and intent. This wasn't a shelter, not a hastily made cache. This was infrastructure. Designed, calibrated, hidden not by brute force but by geometry and probability. He carefully inspected the surrounding walls. The stone here was even smoother than in the previous part of the chamber. The wall's curvature seemed to submit to the container's form, not vice versa. The space was created for the object, not the object adapted to the space. Ethan automatically began searching for signs of security. Cameras, sensors, wires, anything indicating a modern control system. But there was nothing. No sound, no light, no hint of electronics, not even holes for cables. This place didn't depend on power. It didn't need maintenance. The container stood here not because it was guarded. It stood here because it was impossible to find. That realization proved the heaviest. Any preservation system can be hacked, bypassed, disabled, but a system based on the assumption that no one would search was almost perfect. Ethan circled the container again, now slower. He noted the absence of human presence traces. No trash, no tools, no random scratches. Even the rust looked even, as if accepted as permissible state, not as a problem. Here, nothing was tried to be kept in ideal condition here. They counted on time. He stopped at the doors. They faced not the chamber's entrance but its blank wall. That meant upon opening, all contents remained hidden from casual view. Even if someone somehow ended up here, they'd have to approach closely to see inside. Ethan placed his palm on the cold metal. The container was colder than the surrounding stone. It held temperature differently, as if not belonging to this place. Under his hand, there was a light vibration, not movement, but rather a response to touch, like a massive object existing in its own inertia. The thought of what's inside arose but didn't form immediately. He didn't allow himself fantasies. Experience taught him. Reality is almost always more grounded, and therefore more terrifying. He stepped back and glanced around. The entry crevice now seemed even narrower, almost symbolic, as if this space wasn't meant for return, or meant only for those who knew what to seek. The container stood in the chamber's center like a fact, not a threat, not a promise, as something not needing explanation. It didn't try to attract attention. It simply was. And at that moment, Ethan understood. He hadn't ended up in a cache or abandoned site. He had ended up in a place that was never forgotten, just not shown. Ethan didn't touch the container's doors for a long time. He stood opposite, allowing his gaze to adjust to its presence, like to a living being not to be disturbed without reason. In the mountains, he had grown accustomed to respecting limits, not those marked by signs, but those felt by the body. Now, that limit was here. He placed his palms on the locking bars. The metal was cold but not dead, dense, retaining temperature differently than stone. Ethan didn't yank, didn't pull. He applied even force, testing resistance, as he once checked weapon mechanisms, without haste, without anger. The bar yielded not immediately but with a quiet, low sound that didn't echo. It seemed to vanish into the walls. That sound alerted him more than rust's creak. The container didn't scream. It responded. Ethan evened his breathing and released the second lock. His fingers worked precisely, economically, no struggle. The doors didn't swing open. They stayed in place, as if awaiting the next action. He braced his shoulder and gently pushed. A gap formed between the doors. No smell of dampness or dust escaped from inside, only dry, sterile air, like that he remembered from warehouses and hangars. The smell of old metal and enclosed space. That smell was too familiar to be appropriate here. Ethan widened the opening and directed the headlamp beam inside. First, he saw repetition. Rows of identical forms extended deep into the container, from floor to ceiling, arranged with precision, allowing not a centimeter of waste. These were suitcases, standard size, one model, one color. Each was encased in a transparent vacuum shell, stretched so tightly that edges and handles seemed flattened, almost sculptural. He froze, not from shock, from the need to comprehend the scale. The suitcases stood in even columns, with a narrow central aisle between them. No labels, no names, no marks. Individuality was excluded here as an error. Everything submitted to repetition. Ethan crossed the threshold. The sound of steps changed. The metal floor of the container damped impact differently than stone. The air inside was noticeably colder, denser, as if stored separately from the surrounding space. The headlamp beam slid over smooth surfaces, encountering no disorder, no signs of haste. He crouched by the nearest suitcase. The vacuum film was intact, without cracks or clouding. He ran his finger over the surface, feeling resilient resistance. The contents were packed tightly, without play. Ethan pulled out his multitool. The metal's weight in his hand was familiar, calming. He made a careful incision along the film's edge, just enough to breach hermeticity. There was a quiet hissing sound, almost intimate, like an exhalation. He stopped and listened. Nothing followed. He removed the film and opened the suitcase. Inside lay money, not scattered, not carelessly. Bills were folded in dense stacks, aligned at the edges, bound with bands. Different currencies occupied their sections, each strictly separated. New series neighbored old ones, some long out of circulation. The paper was dry, crisp, without mold or wear. Ethan didn't touch them, he just looked. One suitcase, and that was enough to understand. Before him wasn't random accumulation, this was a system, storage, thoughtful, long-term. He closed the suitcase and rose, allowing his mind to expand to the container scale. He walked down the central aisle. Illuminating the row's repetition amplified the effect. Hundreds, possibly thousands of suitcases, all identical, all sealed. Some under film had barely noticeable abrasions, as if once handled, moved, returned, not chaotically, selectively. That was important. He stopped midway through the container and looked back. The inner walls were clean, without inscriptions, without time's traces, no dates, no messages. This place didn't try to tell a story, it performed a function. Ethan recalled the dust around the container's base, even, untouched. That meant suitcases could be moved not here, or moved rarely, or checked without removal. The thought that money could exist as confirmation, not as means, caught in his mind. He opened another suitcase. The layout was different. Other currencies, different ratio of old and new series. That meant not just storage, but updating. Money arrived here over time. They were replaced, refreshed, monitored for relevance. Ethan closed the suitcase and carefully returned the film to place. Understanding hermeticity was already breached, but trying to minimize the trace. He memorized this suitcase's position, as one memorized landmarks on terrain, not as proof, as a mark for memory. He stepped back to the container's doors. At that moment, the thought of taking something flashed and vanished, not as temptation, as a logic check. Any removal would disrupt balance, not because he'd be caught, but because the system would notice discrepancy, even if not immediately. This wasn't treasure. Treasures lie unattended. This was a reserve, living, breathing through time, meant for use not now, but when now ceased to exist. Ethan closed the container's doors with the same caution as he opened them. The metal converged again. Locks returned to initial position. The sound was final, devoid of emotion. He exited the container and stopped in the chamber, allowing the space to become empty again. But the emptiness was different now. Now it contained knowledge. Ethan understood. He had touched not wealth, but a mechanism, and this mechanism didn't need him. It simply allowed his presence. Ethan remained in the chamber longer than planned, not from hesitation, from the need to understand. After the container's doors closed again, the space seemed to change density. It didn't become hostile but ceased to be neutral, like a room where a conversation had already occurred that couldn't be undone. He returned to the nearest row of suitcases, now looking differently, not as contents, but as traces of handling. Some vacuum shells had barely noticeable abrasions at edges, microscratches where fingers usually grip, not chaotically, not en masse, selectively. That meant one thing. The suitcases weren't just stored, they were checked, possibly moved, possibly confirmed in presence, like checking instrument readings, not like taking money. Ethan walked down the central aisle, noting differences. Here the film was absolutely smooth. A bit further, pressure marks as from a strap there, a faint imprint as if the suitcase was briefly removed and returned. These details formed a pattern. He recalled service, warehouses, control rounds, when nothing is taken, but everything must be. Presence itself is function. The container, he understood, wasn't a cash box, it was an anchor, not necessarily a withdrawal point, but a reference point, a place where resource reality is confirmed. Money here didn't necessarily have to leave, it was enough to know they existed in the needed volume, in the needed state, at the needed moment. Such certainty changes decisions long before anything is spent. That thought wasn't a guess, it fit evenly, like the last element without which the picture remained incomplete. He had seen this before in another form. Fuel depots, reserve routes, hidden airfields that were never used, but precisely therefore priceless. A system survives not by acting, but by being ready to act. Ethan stepped back and surveyed the container wholly. The absence of security ceased to seem strange. Here, no surveillance was required. No cameras, no electronics, nothing that could be disabled, hacked, or noticed. This system relied not on control, but on probability, on no one coming here, and if they did, not understanding. He recalled again the narrow crevice, the entry's geometry, how the mountain hid the opening with angle and shadow. It wasn't an obstacle, it was a filter. Only one person could pass, without cargo, without a group. Any attempt to use this place as a warehouse would require destroying the concealment principle itself. That meant no regular removal was planned, that meant the money worked by the fact of their existence. The thought of taking even one suitcase arose again, this time as pure experiment. He imagined the chain of consequences. Even if unnoticed immediately, imbalance would appear, not here, somewhere else. A report wouldn't match, confirmation would fail, and then the system, invisible and impersonal, would start correcting, not necessarily by force, rather by redistribution, accidents, coincidences. Ethan disliked unknown systems, he preferred opponents with form. Here, there was no form, only intent stretched through time. He carefully checked that all suitcases he touched stood evenly, returned the film to place where he cut it, understanding perfect hermeticity wouldn't return, but trying to minimize the trace. It wasn't so much camouflage as respect for the space that hadn't asked for intrusion. Closing the container the second time, he caught himself on a sense of completion, not dissatisfaction, completion of a stage. The metal converged locks returned to initial position, and the container became again what it was, a mute fact. When he turned to the exit, the cold air from the crevice seemed sharper. There was no wind inside the chamber, but outside it felt different, denser, insistent, like a warning not spoken aloud. Ethan squeezed back through the narrow passage, this time slower. The stone accepted his body with the same indifference as before. When he emerged outside, the sky had noticeably darkened, clouds had shifted lower, layers denser, as if the weather decided to accelerate. He quickly gathered his backpack, checked the fastening, put on gloves. Snow wasn't falling yet, but the air was saturated with moisture. Experience suggested, the window will close quickly. And he wasn't wrong. The first gusts of wind hit almost as soon as he began descending. They weren't dangerous but insistent, disrupting rhythm. Temperature dropped faster than forecast. Such changes are rarely random in the mountains, and he knew that. Descending, he constantly glanced back, not at the chamber, at the slope overall. Already from a few dozen meters, the line in the rock vanished. Angle, shadow, distance, and the place ceased to exist for the eye. It was done perfectly, too perfectly for chance. Intuition, honed by more than one combat outing, signaled, not fear, premonition. This place wouldn't be allowed publicity, not because it was physically dangerous, but because it was conceptually dangerous. Its existence violated too many notions of where and how power is located. Ethan understood. If he spoke, not now, but ever, the reaction would be quiet. There wouldn't be helicopters and cordons, there would be silence, closed routes, blurred formulations. Dangerous area. Geological instability. A system like the one he saw doesn't fight facts, it makes them uninteresting. When the first snowflakes touched his jacket, he was already below the line of ridges. Snow intensified quickly, erasing tracks, smoothing relief. The mountain restored its surface, as if closing a lid. He walked down, accelerating, not from panic, from understanding. Lingering longer was impossible, not because of weather, because of what he now carried. By evening, he emerged onto the section where the trail became discernible again. Here, the wind was weaker, snow lay more evenly. The mountain released him as calmly as it admitted, without emotion, without traces. Ethan felt no triumph, no fear, he felt responsibility, not to someone, but to the fact itself of what he saw. He understood. The war he had gone through was simple. There were sides, goals, front lines. Here was silence and calculation. And when he glanced back one last time at the slope where there was nothing but stones and snow, he realized. He wasn't leaving a cache, he was leaving a system that would continue existing without him, but no longer without the consequences of his presence. 3 days after descending, Ethan sat in a small office with frosted windows overlooking a grey courtyard. The weather in the city was even, unremarkable, as if the world deliberately avoided sharp contrasts. He kept his hands on his knees, back straight, a habit he hadn't shed after service. He came not with a sensation or accusation, he came with a formulation. In the report he submitted to the regional office, there were no words like container, money, or cache. There were other terms. Anomalous cavity, non-standard rock geometry, potential risk for tourist routes. He spoke the language the system understood and accepted without resistance. He was received by a man in his 50s named Alex Raven, short, stocky, with neatly trimmed grey hair and heavy eyelids. Raven gave the impression of a man who rarely surprises. His suit was unassuming, movements economical. He didn't ask unnecessary questions and didn't interrupt. He listened attentively, making short notes in a folder without identifying marks. "Are you sure the cavity is stable?" he asked in a neutral tone, not lifting his eyes. "It doesn't look natural," Ethan replied, "and that's why it could be dangerous." That was the truth, just not all of it. 48 hours after submitting the report, the area was closed. The formulation appeared on the official website. Temporary access restriction due to geological assessment, without details, without timelines. Maps updated quickly, faster than he expected. Routes that were clearly marked a week ago now broke off earlier, leaving an empty zone without labels. Ethan noticed this at night, opening the map on his laptop. He zoomed in, compared versions, checked archives. The coordinates he indicated hadn't vanished completely, they became blurred, like a stain left not by an eraser but by water. He wasn't called with questions about contents, no one clarified what exactly he saw deep inside. His report was accepted, registered, and distributed. The information fragmented into parts, each separately seeming insignificant. He received an invitation for a clarifying conversation a week later. This time, he was met by two. The second was Samuel Cliff, a lean man in his 40s with sharp features and restless hands. He often changed posture, as if inwardly not rushing, though the conversation didn't require haste. Cliff asked questions quickly but superficially, as if completing a checklist. "Are you sure you didn't misjudge the size? Could it be an old mine? Were there water traces?" When Ethan himself mentioned the container and contents, the reaction was minimal. Cliff nodded. Raven made another note. No clarifications, no interest. That alerted more than distrust. After the meeting, a pause ensued. Responses to his letters became shorter, tone polite but detached. "Assessment continues, no additional actions required, will contact if necessary." They didn't contact. A month later, he noticed access to some public archives became harder, requests processed longer. Some documents returned with temporarily unavailable. Nothing direct, nothing contestable. He understood. The system doesn't refute him, it doesn't say, "This doesn't exist." It says, "This isn't important." And therein lay its strength. The mountain wasn't destroyed, it remained in place. But its image in collective perception changed. It became a risk zone, a place where trails don't lead and maps don't call. Interest in it waned on its own. Tourists don't argue with warnings phrased in dry language of concern. Ethan began writing, not for publication, not for exposure. He wrote for preservation, detailed, methodical, without emotion. He described the route, light, angles, distances, fixed sensations impossible to convey with diagrams. He made copies, paper and digital, stored them separately, not linking them. This became his own form of reserve, not a cache, but a support point. He called it a memory storeroom. If ever needed, he could reconstruct the whole picture, not for court, for understanding. Sometimes it seemed to him he was being watched, but the sensation was not sharp but background, like weather pressure. He quickly realized. If surveillance existed, it didn't concern him as a person. He was a variable, not a target. The system didn't threaten it, wearied. Every time he thought of telling more, inertia arose. Too much effort, too little response. Any attempt to attract attention would require fighting not bands, but indifference. That was an effective form of protection. He recalled the container, its simplicity, absence of security, reliability built not on prohibitions but on low discovery probability. The same principle worked here. By late autumn, the zone was transferred to long-term restriction status. The formulation changed, became ecological. Now it spoke of landscape preservation, minimizing human impact, care. Ethan understood. The mountain wouldn't vanish anymore, it would simply become unnoticeable. And that's when he finally decided to keep the knowledge silent, not as defeat, but as choice. He didn't feel betrayed, he felt included, albeit on the periphery, in a mechanism that prefers silence to noise. Memory became his responsibility. Ethan's life externally returned to its usual course. He woke early again, drank strong tea without sugar, went to work, and returned evenings to the apartment with windows to the courtyard. Same routes, same faces in transport, same noise from which he once fled to the mountains. Nothing changed, and that felt strange. He himself had changed. He no longer perceived space as emptiness. Empty now meant covered, not containing nothing. He looked at familiar places, parking lots, wastelands, warehouse districts, and saw not absence but layers. Layer of visible, layer of permitted, layer of what doesn't require explanation, and somewhere deeper, the layer that needs neither witnesses nor signs. The mountain from his memory lived in that last layer. Sometimes he caught himself mentally returning there, not to the container itself, but to the moment when space ceased to be neutral. He understood now. The money was merely a form, they weren't the center. The center was discipline, a way of thinking where preparation is more important than action, and presence more than use. That frightened more than any sum. He saw confirmation of this everywhere, though he didn't seek it. In news, stories flashed of sudden resources appearing where logic failed, of projects that didn't die despite sanctions, crises, bands of movements that continued existing without being visible. He didn't voice conclusions, he just noted coincidence. The system, he understood, doesn't need constant presence to control. It's enough to be ready, enough to have a reserve, material or conceptual, that can be activated when usual mechanisms fail. And then control manifests not as order, but as inevitability. The mountain remained there, he knew that for sure. Stone doesn't react to papers and map updates. The container remained too, closed, patient, ready. Nothing vanished. What vanished was only the possibility to speak of it without effort. Ethan didn't become richer, he didn't gain accesses, connections, influence. He didn't become a hero or a target. He became more precise, cautious in words, slower in conclusions. He stopped taking absence for emptiness and silence for ignorance. The knowledge he carried didn't require application, it became his personal reserve, like the container in the mountain, only without metal and locks. He didn't use it, he knew it existed, and that was enough to assess risks, promises, loud statements differently. Sometimes he went on walks outside the city, not to those mountains, he didn't return there. He walked forest trails, along rivers, through places where landscape didn't strive to impress. He looked at shadows and lines, at how light breaks surfaces, not from suspicion, from respect for complexity. He understood one more thing. Preparation is a form of humility. He who prepares for the worst doesn't claim control over the future, he acknowledges its unpredictability. The container was an act of faith, not in people, not in ideology, but in continuation, in the world changing in waves, and survival belonging not to the loudest, but to the ready. That awareness led him to quiet peace, not consolation, but clarity. In evenings, he sometimes opened his notes, not to reread, but to confirm memory lived. He added nothing and removed nothing. The notes weren't a story, but a support. He knew. If ever needed, he could reconstruct the route, entry form, metals cold. But he also knew necessity might not arise, and that would be the best outcome. He stopped waiting for events to unfold. The world continued living as it did, loudly, unevenly, contradictorily. And somewhere under that surface, deeper than maps and headlines, existed structures not requiring attention. They didn't need recognition because their strength was in readiness, not demonstration. In one of the quiet nights, when the city was especially calm, Ethan thought of God, not as before, not as judge or protector, rather as a measure, as a limit of knowledge not to be crossed and not needing to be. He understood. Man isn't given to know everything, and that's not punishment, but mercy. We are given exactly as much understanding as needed not to become arrogant and not to break. The mountain remained in its place, the container remained in the mountain. The system continued existing without his participation, and he continued living, not becoming richer or stronger, but becoming more attentive to what doesn't vanish even when erased from the map. And that proved enough. Sometimes God doesn't make a miracle loud, he doesn't part the sky and doesn't speak to us aloud. Sometimes his miracle is what we notice, not what we are shown. The mountain remained in place, the container remained inside. But the most important changed not in stone, but in the man, because God gives us not all the world's knowledge, but exactly as much as we can bear without losing humility. In our daily life, the same happens. We rush, worry, seek answers, but forget. Not everything should be revealed at once. Sometimes faith is the ability to go on, knowing not everything is meant for us to understand today. If this story made you think, share it with those who now need silence and hope. Write in the comments from which city or country you're watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss new stories. May the Lord keep you, and your loved ones may He give.